of my colleagues that refused to play it.
When the sound of rock and roll came along, the excitement of it, the sexuality of it was tremendously appealing.
It was a foreign sound, it was raucous, and to have somebody just yell at you was, it was an affront.
If you want to think it's nasty or sexy, you could, but I mean, it's really marvelous.
For any musical innovation is full of danger to the whole state and ought to be prohibited. When modes of music change, the fundamental laws of the state always change with them. Plato. America was all shook up, and would be for the next 2 decades. The youth culture was fascinated. The establishment was concerned. Newspapers throughout the world reported on this growing cultural conflict, a conflict stimulated by music, a music with troubling roots.
Rock was an occurrence after blues and R&B and American folk music.
As early as the 1930s, Big Joe Williams stormed the South with his rock riffs. Woody Guthrie was inspiring thousands with his rebellious folk songs. Robert Johnson wooed women throughout the South with his haunting blues. Louis Jordan belted out his big beat jazz in the 1940s. Hank Williams was boogieing with his country sound throughout Tennessee. Roosevelt Sykes was rocking New Orleans with his upbeat jazz. And Muddy Waters inched closer to rock and roll with his electric blues.
The story of poor boys with guitars. Boys from the ghetto, from the farm, from the barrio.
It was more than poverty that caused concern. By the late 40s, rock and roll had already been born.
Rock and roll was rhythm and blues, and Alan Freed changed the name.
This music was mostly part of the urban African-American culture at the time.
Negro has had a major influence on the total culture.
There is little doubt of the impact blacks had on rock and roll, yet that in itself created a problem.
You've got to transpose yourself back to the 50s now.
Parents of white America didn't want their kids listening to black music.
Television commentators and, kind of keepers of the faith of the day felt that their responsibility to say that this was somehow dark.
Radio stations attempted to ease this conflict by playing white versions of black songs.
You could look at the top 10 and probably about 5, 6, 7 of the records were white remakes of rhythm and blues songs.
The Righteous Brothers had a lot of trouble getting our music played. What they were really saying, it sounds black and we can't play it.
At the same time, a fragment of this new culture was causing other concerns for the establishment.
We, as a nation, are not far from the kind of moral decay that has brought on the fall of other nations and people.
They correctly sensed that the momentum from this rock and roll was going to overturn society.
And while society had not been completely overturned, a new youth culture had emerged.
40s, teenagers were submissive. Rock and roll represented a revolt against the social structure.
The societal conflict would only subside when it appeared the music died.
The rock and roll world changes completely. Rock historians, they'll point out eternally, it's not shaking up for the better.
Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry were living outside the general norms of established society.
Elvis Presley entered the army. Little Richard joined the ministry.
Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, Richie Valens went down in that airplane and closed the first chapter.
Rock and roll came along and it was like, wow, this is brilliant. It became watered down very quickly.
What happened was record producers started to invent their own people. Most of them were Italian, and they changed their names.
And while most agreed the music declined, the early years of rock and roll had given birth to a dynamic youth culture.
They were the phenomenons in the 1950s that really planted the seeds of the social changes that took place in the 60s.
As the 50s faded into the 60s, rock and roll transformed.
It became more musical. That's the main thing.
Perhaps there was a more significant change within the youth culture.
By the end of the 50s and the early 60s, young people in America were ready to bust out.
The younger generation started questioning authority, not just doing something because somebody told you to do it.
This new independence was closely linked to the music that was tied to the youth culture.
The culture was leading the music. when I was a young man. And then the music started leading the culture.
No longer was it a matter of singing Earth Angel.
And the music was part of the culture. You'd go to the rallies and you'd hear the music.
It was the beginning of creating social awareness through art.
It was a time where the music was such an important part of young people's lifestyle.
We never thought that it would become what it has become.
Together, the music and the culture melded, feeding off each other.
Community is established, affecting each other, the energy, the band members, and especially the music.
The audience wants to be transformed to something a little wider, something that enlarges them.
People were looking for a message, and they idolized these musicians, and they embraced their philosophies.
So they would take it right up to that spot, as far as politics and religion are concerned, which is lift off.
Recognizing this relationship, bands and musicians looked at the youth culture with respect, opening minds and creating a social awareness.
So many more millions of people were being affected by an image.
The young, privileged, affluent children of the culture began to see themselves as an oppressed class.
We really could have an effect on history, and it was simply by taking seriously the words of the Constitution.
The civil rights movement became the wellspring of student activism and inspired our entire generation.
The movement was really started and maintained by some of those great songs.
The injustices that the establishment allowed proved to be at the root of the primary conflict. Students throughout the country aligned with civil rights activists in a battle against the establishment.
I looked at the fact that the music, more in the early 60s, I think really had an impact in the civil rights movement.
The music, the youth culture, and black activists eventually arrived at a subliminal compromise with the establishment, and in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act. The youth culture would reach other compromises, but only after intense battles.
My generation found that it had great power and that it had allies and that could get together.
The problem is seeing our unity, particularly black and white, particularly square and hippie.
It brought a lot of people together, complexes of people.
This unique unity within the youth culture would become known as America's Second Revolution.
The country wants to move in a different direction.
Not everyone agreed with the youth culture.
It tore the nation apart, and I think to some degree we're still suffering from that.
It was the age of selfishness, it was the age of anti-authority.
And a general lack of civility and a general disrespect for intellectual activity.
And I just denounced the demonstrators 100%.
Our young people, in disturbing numbers, appear to reject all form of authority.
The gap would grow wider. With increased involvement in the Vietnam War, an electrifying issue was at the forefront of the youth culture.
And as you saw at the Woodstock Festival, it was about peace and love, and at the same time it was a very strong anti-war message.
There was so much protest that it was very difficult to conduct the war.
Rock and roll and the youth culture slipped into a new decade. Within months, rock stars Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison would overdose on drugs. The National Guard would storm the Kent State and Jackson State campuses, killing 6. Rock and roll and the youth culture would never be the same. Rock and roll had threatened the American culture, exposing racism, glorifying sexuality, and liberating America's youth. The establishment was revolted. Many would later wish for the return of these days. As the 50s transitioned into the 60s, civil rights, freedom of speech, and peace would become the anthems of rock and roll and the basis of a cultural revolution. After turmoil, bloodshed, and heartache, there would come understanding. Demonstrations had become excessive. The National Guard had been too forceful. The counterculture would dampen their demands. The establishment would recognize their injustices. America would reach a new age through compromise.
A generation of young people stopped a war.